Now, this bill is named after Kayla Hamilton. She paid the ultimate price for the Democrats' open borders. She was found in her own bedroom, raped, tied up, and then strangled with a phone cord. Her murder was recorded on her boyfriend's voicemail when she desperately called him for help. Kayla was just 20 years old. Now, she was murdered by a 17-year-old MS-13 gang member who Biden's administration welcomed into our country. Police investigating her murder noticed that her assailant had gang tattoos, and one call to El Salvadorian authorities confirmed he was a known MS-13 gang member, something that federal officials never bothered to ask as they recklessly placed him in Kayla's neighborhood. The Trump administration has stopped this madness, thank God.
So what you've just witnessed right there in that virally packaged sliver of outrage theater is nothing short of a masterclass in the most cynical form of political manipulation this nation has ever produced. Because what Tom McClintock just did on the House floor was not an exercise in legislating or problem-solving, or even genuine grief, but instead a calculated deployment of human tragedy as a weapon in service of a xenophobic political project that has been meticulously constructed over the past decade to transform the American body politic into something dark and atavistic and violently exclusionary. We need to understand right now precisely what is happening here, because the stakes could not be higher, and I'm going to break down exactly how this grotesque performance functions as propaganda, and why you should be absolutely enraged, not by what McClintock claims happened, but by what he's doing to our capacity for rational democratic discourse in pursuit of authoritarian ends. The first thing you need to grasp with crystalline clarity is that while illegal border crossings did surge to record levels under President Biden, averaging 2 million per year from 2021 to 2023, by the time we reach this moment in December 2025, the number of migrants crossing into the U.S. illegally at the southern border had reached the lowest point of Biden's administration in September, with U.S. Border Patrol agents recording nearly 54,000 apprehensions. Border Patrol apprehensions along the southwest border had decreased more than 70% from the same period in 2023 after the Biden-Harris administration took executive action in June, which means that the very premise McClintock is deploying here about Biden's so-called open borders causing an ongoing crisis is fundamentally detached from empirical reality at the precise moment he's weaponizing this young woman's death. Listen to me when I tell you that this is not a minor discrepancy or a difference of interpretation, but an Orwellian inversion of truth, whereby the speaker exploits our collective grief and fear to manufacture a crisis that no longer exists in the form he describes. And what's most insidious about this tactic is that it immunizes itself against factual correction, because the moment anyone points out that border crossings have plummeted, they can be accused of not caring about Kayla Hamilton's murder, which is precisely the discursive trap that authoritarian movements construct to place themselves beyond the reach of evidence. But here's where this gets even more explosive, and where you need to pay extremely close attention, because I'm about to drop some truth bombs that completely obliterate the entire ideological edifice McClintock is constructing right before your eyes, and it begins with understanding what the actual data tells us about immigrants and crime. The research does not support the view that immigrants commit crime or are incarcerated at higher rates than native-born Americans, with numerous studies showing that immigration is not linked to higher levels of crime, but rather the opposite. And when we drill down specifically into the question that Republicans love to weaponize, researchers examining the relationship between undocumented immigrants and crime come to similar conclusions, with numerous studies showing that undocumented immigration does not increase violent crime. Are you hearing this? Undocumented immigrants are arrested at less than half the rate of native-born U.S. citizens for violent and drug crimes, and a quarter the rate of native-born citizens for property crimes, according to Department of Justice research, and immigrants are 60% less likely to be incarcerated than U.S.-born citizens in recent decades, and the incarceration gap has widened such that immigrants today are 60% less likely to be incarcerated than the U.S.-born, based on analysis of 150 years of census data. This isn't liberal spin or progressive wishful thinking. This is peer-reviewed social science published by the National Bureau of Economic Research and replicated across multiple methodologies and datasets, including Texas data showing felony crime rates of 761 per 100,000 for undocumented immigrants, compared to 10,000 for U.S.-born citizens, Tanzine, which means that when McClintock stands there and blames Biden's immigration policies for creating a crime wave, he is not merely exaggerating or selectively presenting evidence, but actively lying to the American people in service of white nationalist fearmongering. Now I want you to really feel the full weight of what I'm about to say, because this is where the moral obscenity of McClintock's performance becomes absolutely undeniable, and this is where we need to talk about MS-13 specifically, since that's the boogeyman he's invoking with maximum dramatic effect. The reality that Republicans desperately want to obscure is that of approximately 240,000 unaccompanied minors the U.S. Border Patrol apprehended since fiscal year 2012. Only 56 were suspected or confirmed to be associated with MS-13, which represents literally 0.02% of unaccompanied minors, and the Suffolk County Police Department examined a sample of active MS-13 members and found that just a quarter had come to the U.S. as unaccompanied minors, and Suffolk County Police Department examined a sample which completely demolishes the narrative that the border is some kind of MS-13 conveyor belt. Furthermore, there is no evidence that the MS-13 is sending gang members or taking advantage of the flow of unaccompanied minors to place gang leaders in the United States, according to researchers who actually study this gang systematically. And what we know instead is that when young gang members travel from El Salvador to the U.S., they are driven by the same economic factors driving other Central American immigrants, with even a 19-year-old gang leader charged with 6 murders on Long Island, telling his ex-girlfriend he was not a member of the gang when he came to the U.S. from El Salvador, and it was only later, in the New York suburbs, that he was recruited. This is absolutely critical, because it reveals that MS-13 is not primarily an immigration problem, but a domestic social problem rooted in the vulnerability of young migrants who lack support systems and community resources once they arrive in American communities, which means that the actual solution involves robust social services and community intervention programs, not brutal deportation regimes. What makes McClintock's framing so particularly despicable is that he's engaged in what scholars of genocide call accusation in a mirror, whereby the perpetrators of violence accuse their victims of the very crimes they themselves are committing, because the overwhelming evidence shows that some observers have suggested that MS-13's evolution in Central America could continue to drive unauthorized migration into the United States by those seeking to escape the gang and its violence, with 63% of unaccompanied children from El Salvador reporting that they had experienced or been threatened with gang-related violence, which means these children are fleeing MS-13 and seeking asylum from the very violence that McClintock pretends to care about. And here's what should make your blood absolutely boil with righteous fury. Unaccompanied minors who migrate to the United States are easy prey for gangs like MS-13, because they are young, vulnerable, and have virtually no social networks in a new country. Yet the number of young migrants that join the gang once placed in the United States is small, with 0.2% involved in gang violence in the Washington, D.C. area, out of 18,000 unaccompanied minors who arrived. So what we're watching in real time is a Republican congressman exploiting a tragedy that resulted from our failure to provide adequate social services and community support to vulnerable migrant youth in order to argue for policies that would send more vulnerable youth back into the arms of the gangs they're fleeing, thereby guaranteeing more violence and more death and more Kayla Hamiltons. I need you to understand something profound about the historical moment we're inhabiting right now, because misinformation about immigrants has long been a tool of political fearmongering, but Trump has taken it to new heights, using false narratives to incite fear and rally his base, with Trump and his surrogates relying heavily on the rhetorical tactic of associating migrants with criminality through sensationalist anecdotes, exaggeration, and outright lies. And this didn't emerge from nowhere, but represents the culmination of a deliberate strategic shift within the Republican Party. You see, in the early to mid-20th century, Democrats were often the party that supported restrictive immigration and border policies, while most Republicans at the national level, strongly supported by business, tended to endorse policies that encouraged the easy flow of workers across the border and increased levels of legal immigration, and even Ronald Reagan, in his final speech as president, delivered an impassioned ode to immigrants who made America a nation forever young, forever bursting with energy and new ideas. But around 2009, a dramatic shift in political rhetoric took place when the Tea Party movement brought border security and racial resentment towards immigrants center stage. This transformation accelerated catastrophically under Trump, and now we live in an environment where Republican rhetoric has had a dramatic impact on public opinion, with the number of people supporting the deportation of undocumented immigrants jumping from 32% to 47% between 2016 and 2024, which demonstrates that this isn't merely politicians responding to public sentiment, but politicians actively manufacturing public sentiment through sustained propaganda campaigns built on lies. The mechanics of how this propaganda operates deserve our most careful scrutiny, because what McClintock is doing follows a precise template that has been refined and perfected over years of experimentation in right-wing media ecosystems. And it works like this. First, you select an individual tragedy that involves a member of the demonized outgroup. Then you present that tragedy with maximum emotional intensity and graphic detail specifically designed to overwhelm rational thought and trigger our evolutionarily ancient threat detection systems. Then you assert without evidence a causal connection between that tragedy and the broad policy you oppose, and finally you generalize from that single anecdote to an entire population, thereby transforming individual human beings into an undifferentiated threatening mass. This is textbook fascist rhetoric, and I use that term with precision and care, because the function of this discourse is to create what Hannah Arendt called a fictitious world, in which feelings of fear and resentment take precedence over empirical reality, and once you've constructed that fictitious world, you can justify essentially any level of violence against the targeted population, because they've been discursively transformed from vulnerable human beings seeking safety into an existential threat to the nation itself. Notice how McClintock describes the Biden administration as having welcomed an MS-13 gang member and recklessly placed him in Kayla's neighborhood, language that implies intentionality and malice on the part of government officials who supposedly knew this person was dangerous and put him there anyway, which is an absolutely monstrous accusation that serves to paint Democrats not as people with different policy views, but as active collaborators in murder. And here's what should terrify you about where this leads, because we're not talking about abstract political theory, but about real material consequences that are unfolding right now in December 2025, as the number of migrants crossing the U.S. southern border illegally in Trump's first full month in office plunged to about 8,450 apprehensions in February 2025, which would be the lowest monthly apprehensions tally recorded by Border Patrol since at least fiscal year 2000, through the deployment of what the article describes as sweeping, government-wide immigration crackdown, and I want you to think carefully about what sweeping means in this context, because while Biden also moved to curtail asylum during his last year in office, Trump's unprecedented actions are far more restrictive, with the Trump administration not processing in any significant capacity asylum seekers at official border entry points, and quickly terminating a Biden-era system that facilitated processing through a government app. What we're witnessing is the systematic dismantling of asylum as a legal concept in the United States, the deliberate creation of conditions whereby people fleeing persecution have no legal avenue to seek protection, and when you combine that with Trump's rhetoric about implementing the largest deportation effort in American history, what you get is the infrastructure for state violence on a scale we haven't seen in this country since the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. But let me bring this back to the fundamental question of what McClintock is actually accomplishing with his performance on the House floor, because the answer reveals something crucial about how contemporary conservatism functions as an intellectual and moral project. The bill he's ostensibly discussing, H.R. 437-1, the Kayla Hamilton Act, is being considered by the Rules Committee, and we can infer from context that it likely involves enhanced screening or penalties related to gang affiliation. But here's the thing. Even if we assume for the sake of argument that more robust screening mechanisms might prevent some small number of dangerous individuals from entering the country, that policy prescription has absolutely nothing to do with the apocalyptic rhetoric about open borders and Democrats welcoming gang members. The actual evidence shows that the Biden administration as of May had allowed in 5.7 million migrants who had crossed illegally into the United States from Mexico or Canada to pursue their immigration cases or were lawfully paroled into the country, but implementation of Biden's asylum restrictions drastically reduced the number of migrants released into the country, with 17% of irregular border encounters released into the United States in September, compared to the 65% release rate during the first month of fiscal year 2024, which means that even under Biden, the system was becoming dramatically more restrictive. So the entire premise that there's this binary choice between Trump's draconian enforcement regime and Biden's alleged open borders is a false dichotomy constructed to preclude any discussion of humane, effective immigration policy that balances security concerns with our legal obligations under domestic and international law. What infuriates me beyond measure is how McClintock and his fellow Republicans have systematically poisoned the well of democratic debate by making it literally impossible to have a rational conversation about immigration policy, because the moment anyone attempts to introduce data or nuance or complexity, they get accused of not caring about crime victims, and meanwhile the actual victims of MS-13 violence, who are overwhelmingly Central Americans and often minors, get completely erased from the discourse. The vast majority of MS-13 victims are young immigrants, many of them undocumented, which means that if Republicans actually cared about preventing MS-13 violence, they would be advocating for policies that protect vulnerable migrant youth, not policies that make them more vulnerable. But of course they don't actually care about MS-13 violence, except insofar as it can be instrumentalized to advance their white nationalist political agenda, and I say white nationalist with full intentionality, because Trump has normalized dehumanizing rhetoric and policies against immigrants, referring to undocumented immigrants as animals who are poisoning the blood of our country, which is literally the language of eugenics and ethnic cleansing. Now let's talk about what a genuinely progressive approach to this issue would look like, because it's not enough to simply deconstruct right-wing propaganda. We also need to articulate an affirmative vision of justice that can mobilize people toward collective action. The starting point has to be recognizing that migration is fundamentally a human rights issue, not a crime issue, and that immigrants in the United States commit crimes at lower rates than the U.S.-born population, which holds across immigrant groups including unauthorized immigrants, and has been demonstrated through research as well as findings for Texas, which tracks criminal arrests and convictions by immigration status, which means that any policy framework predicated on the assumption that immigrants represent a crime threat is building on a foundation of lies. Instead, we need to understand that the violence we're seeing in places like Long Island stems from the toxic combination of inadequate social services, aggressive gang recruitment, targeting isolated youth, and law enforcement practices that make immigrant communities afraid to cooperate with police, and law enforcement has called for increased funding for more localized gang task forces, better intelligence sharing efforts between communities, improved screening of those who sponsor unaccompanied minors, caseworkers to better monitor and regularly follow up with those sponsors, and more prosecutors in areas with heightened gang presence, with no police chief or law enforcement official dealing with MS-13 calling for increased deportations during congressional testimony. Do you understand what that means? The people who actually work on gang violence every day are telling Congress that deportation is not the solution they need, but Republicans ignore them because their actual goal isn't public safety but the cruel spectacle of state violence against brown people. What we need instead is a massive investment in community-based violence intervention programs, comprehensive immigration reform that creates legal pathways for people to migrate and work without fear, robust labor protections that prevent employers from exploiting undocumented workers, thereby creating conditions for gang recruitment, and fundamentally a recognition that American foreign policy in Central America, including decades of supporting right-wing death squads and extractive economic policies, has directly contributed to the conditions that drive migration and gang formation. This is where we need to connect immigration justice to the broader struggle against imperialism and capitalism, because you cannot understand MS-13 without understanding how US-backed civil wars in El Salvador created the refugee population that formed the gang in Los Angeles in the 1980s, and you cannot understand contemporary migration patterns without understanding how neoliberal trade agreements like NAFTA and CAFTA destroyed rural economies and forced millions into desperate migration. Everything is connected, and the right understands this, which is why they work so hard to fragment our analysis and prevent us from seeing the systemic nature of oppression, but we must resist that fragmentation and insist on holistic understanding that reveals how white supremacy, capitalism, imperialism, and patriarchy function as interlocking systems of domination. And I want to be absolutely clear about something, because this is where liberal hand-wringing often fails us catastrophically. There is no middle ground to be found with McClintock's position, no compromise to be struck, no bipartisan solution that incorporates even a fraction of his framing, because his entire project is premised on the dehumanization of migrants and the construction of a fictitious crisis designed to justify authoritarian violence. Trump's immigration rhetoric relies increasingly on lies, misinformation, and racist stereotypes, with his claim that immigration is out of control, and his insistence that firm measures are needed becoming central to the Republican platform, including the promise to deport millions of undocumented immigrants soon after taking office. And this represents an existential threat not merely to immigrant communities but to democracy itself, because once you accept the principle that the state can round up and expel millions of people based on their legal status, you have surrendered any pretense of being a rights-respective, constitutional order. The infrastructure of mass deportation is the infrastructure of fascism, and it will not confine itself to undocumented immigrants, but will inevitably expand to encompass anyone the regime deems undesirable, which is why every progressive person, regardless of their immigration status, should understand that an attack on immigrants is an attack on all of us. So where does this leave us in this moment of profound crisis, where the vacuum created by congressional inaction is being filled with fear-mongering, not facts and politics, not policy, and we're watching in real time as the Trump administration constructs the apparatus for state violence on an unprecedented scale? It leaves us with an absolute moral imperative to resist with every tool at our disposal, to build sanctuary in our communities and our institutions, to engage in mass mobilization and direct action, to support immigrant-led organizations doing the essential work of mutual aid and legal defense, and fundamentally to refuse the false choice between security and humanity that McClintock's rhetoric tries to impose. We know from history that moments of authoritarian consolidation require what Timothy Snyder calls anticipatory obedience, whereby ordinary people accommodate themselves in advance to the demands of power, but we also know that resistance is possible, and that even under conditions of severe repression, people can carve out spaces of freedom and dignity, and mutual care. The task before us is to build a movement powerful enough to not merely resist deportations, case by case, but to fundamentally transform the material and ideological conditions that make deportation thinkable, to create a society in which migration is understood not as a crisis to be managed, but as an expression of human freedom to be celebrated, and to recognize that our liberation is bound together across all lines of citizenship and nationality and race. Let me be very clear about what needs to happen right now in the immediate term, because we cannot content ourselves with analysis, however sophisticated, if it doesn't translate into concrete action and organizing. First, every single person watching this needs to educate themselves and their communities about the reality of immigration enforcement, so that when your uncle shares McClintock's speech on Facebook, you can respond with facts, not feelings. You can cite the data showing that immigrants were 60% less likely to be incarcerated than the U.S. born in 2020, and that undocumented immigrants had the lowest homicide arrest rates throughout the entire study period, averaging less than half the rate at which U.S.-born citizens were arrested for homicide. Second, we need to materially support the organizations doing immigrant defense work right now by donating money and time and skills, because when ICE comes to someone's door, the difference between deportation and survival often comes down to whether they have access to legal representation and community networks willing to mobilize on their behalf. Third, we need to make our cities and institutions actual sanctuaries, not just in name but in practice, by refusing to cooperate with immigration enforcement, by using whatever institutional power we have to protect vulnerable people, by understanding that research showing considerably lower felony arrest rates among undocumented immigrants compared to legal immigrants and native-born U.S. citizens helps us understand why the most aggressive immigrant removal programs have not delivered on their crime reduction promises and are unlikely to do so in the future. But beyond these immediate interventions, we need to be building the longer-term infrastructure of resistance that can sustain us through what may be years of intensifying repression, and that means creating mutual aid networks and defense committees and underground railroads if necessary. It means developing alternative media ecosystems that can counter the propaganda churned out by right-wing outlets. It means running candidates for office who will use state power to protect immigrants rather than persecute them. And fundamentally, it means constructing a new political common sense that makes McClintock's rhetoric as unthinkable to future generations as explicit defenses of slavery are to us today. This is the work of political education and cultural transformation, and it requires patience and persistence, and a willingness to have difficult conversations with people who have been marinated in xenophobic propaganda their entire lives. But it is absolutely essential work, because the alternative is acquiescing to the construction of an American apartheid state that will inevitably expand its circle of exclusion until all of us who care about justice find ourselves on the outside. And finally, I want to return to Kayla Hamilton herself, because in all of this political theater and rhetorical combat and data analysis, we must never lose sight of the fact that a young woman was brutally murdered, and that her family is grieving, and that their grief deserves respect, not exploitation. The greatest insult to Kayla's memory is not that progressives refuse to scapegoat immigrants, but that McClintock uses her death as a prop in service of policies that will create more violence and more death and more grieving families on both sides of the border. And if he truly cared about preventing future tragedies like hers, he would be advocating for the community-based interventions and social services that law enforcement experts tell us actually work to prevent gang violence. But he doesn't care about prevention, and he doesn't care about Kayla except as a symbol he can manipulate, and that moral bankruptcy should enrage every person who believes that politics should be about reducing human suffering rather than weaponizing it. We honor Kayla's memory by building a world where vulnerable young people have the support and resources they need to avoid both perpetrating and experiencing violence, where migrants can live without fear of deportation to the very gang violence they fled, where evidence and expertise rather than demagoguery and fear guide our policymaking, and where no family ever again has to experience their private tragedy becoming a public spectacle in service of someone else's political ambitions. The choice before us could not be more stark, and the time for fence-sitting and both sidesism is long past. Either we stand with the forces of human dignity and mutual care and evidence-based policy, or we acquiesce to the forces of dehumanization and cruelty and authoritarian violence, and there is no third option, no moderate position, no compromise that preserves our moral integrity while accommodating even a fraction of McClintock's genocidal logic. So I'm asking you right now to make a choice, to decide which side of history you want to be on, to recognize that this moment demands from each of us a level of moral courage and political commitment that may feel uncomfortable or frightening or beyond what we thought ourselves capable of, but which is nonetheless absolutely necessary if we are to prevent the consolidation of fascism in America. The immigrants in our communities are not abstractions or statistics or symbols, but human beings with dreams and families and dignity, and they deserve our solidarity, not our pity, our resistance, not our resignation, and they will remember who stood with them in this hour of maximum danger and who looked away. This is the test of our generation, and future generations will judge us by whether we met it with courage or cowardice, so let's get to work.